Hi guys, good morning everyone. Online students, please confirm, is my voice audible? Please confirm, is my voice audible? Yes, perfect, good. Guys, in the last session, we discussed about what is manual wiring in the spring and what is auto wiring in the spring. So when one class is dependent on the another class, then we need to perform dependency injection. Earlier, programmer is responsible to perform dependency injection manually. But if you are developing your application by using Spring Framework, then IOC container will take care of dependency injection. Now, if IOC container want to perform dependency injection, we need to provide some information to the IOC container. That information we are providing by using XML configuration. XML file we are giving as the input for the IOC container. In that XML file, we are configuring bean definitions. In the XML file, we are configuring bean definitions. And we are starting this XML file. We are giving this XML file as input for the IOC. And we are starting IOC container programmatically. So by using application context, we are starting our IOC container. So based on scope of the bean, IOC container will create the object for the bean. If the scope is not configured, it will consider the scope as a singleton and it will create the bean object at the time of IOC container starting. If you specify scope as a prototype, then IOC container will not create the object with the eager loading. If the scope is a prototype, when you call the get bean method, then only IOC container will create the bean object. Okay. Now, when one bean is dependent on the another bean, then we are going for manual wiring or auto wiring. What is the meaning of a manual wiring? Manual wiring means programmer will inject the dependent object by using ref attribute. Programmer will inject the dependent object using ref attribute. So you no need to do that because IOC container having the capability to identify the dependent and inject that dependent object into target object. But here, by default, that auto wiring will be disabled. We need to enable the auto wiring. In order to enable the auto wiring, there are modes available. One is by name, second one is by type, and third one is constructor, fourth one is no. No is the default value. That means auto wiring will not happen. Could you please tell me what is by name in the auto wiring? What is by name in the auto wiring? Based on the variable name, it is going to identify the dependent object. So here I'm giving auto wiring for payment processor. If you go to this class here, payment variable is available. Auto wiring is enabled with by name. So if I give it as by name, it will identify with that variable name, is there any dependent bean is available. With that variable name, if there is any bean available, that bean will be injected. So here, every bean should have unique ID. Suppose if you go for by type mechanism, based on data type of the variable, it will identify the dependent object. So here, data type is an interface. Interface can have multiple implementations. Now, here in the payment processor, payment variable data type is iPayment. iPayment is an interface. Then IOC will check for implementation classes available in the configuration file. Here, there are 3 classes available which are implementing that interface. Then IOC will get confused which bean to be injected into target. That is called ambiguity problem. How can we resolve that ambiguity problem? We can resolve ambiguity problem by using 2 options. One is primary is equal to true and the second one is auto wire candidate is equal to false. Which bean you don't want to consider? For that you can specify auto wire candidate is equal to false. Which bean you want to consider? For that you can give primary is equal to true. Any one option is sufficient. The next one is constructor. So I want to perform auto wiring through constructor. Then we are going to specify auto wire is equal to constructor. When I specify auto wire is equal to constructor, then what will happen? It will use by type mechanism. It will use by type mechanism internally to perform dependency injection. When you go for constructor, internally it will use by type to identify dependent object. Got it? So fine. So all of you able to practice auto wiring? Are you clear with auto wiring concept? Is it working? Yes. So with this, we are good with the fundamental concepts of the Spring framework. So first one, what is the dependency injection? What is dependency injection? And we discussed about setter injection and constructor injection. Setter injection and constructor injection. And the third one, we discussed about what is IOC container. We discussed about what is IOC container. Then we have seen manual wiring. Okay, ref attribute. So dependency injection by using ref attribute. So programmer will specify what is the dependent object to perform dependency injection. Then after we have seen auto wiring. We have seen auto wiring. Good. All of you comfortable with all these 5 concepts in the Spring framework? So these are fundamental concepts of the Spring. Okay. If you go for Spring Boot also, same concepts will be available. Again, we are going to work with these concepts by using Spring Boot with the annotation approach. As of now, we discussed with the XML approach. Now, we need to discuss with the annotation approach. Is voice clear now? Satish Kumar. Is it clear now? Online students, any issue with the voice? Audible. Okay. Perfect. Fine, guys. So with this we understood what is the Spring framework, what are the modules available in the Spring, how to develop application by using Spring, how to perform dependency injection, how to work with dependency setter injection, constructor injection, and here we discussed about bean scopes also. Can you tell me what is a bean scope? Bean scope will decide how many objects should be created for the bean, and when the object should be created for the bean, it will be decided by bean scope. If I don't specify bean scope, then what will happen? If I don't specify the bean scope, then IOC will consider that as a singleton. What is the meaning of singleton? Only one object will be created. If whenever you specify scope as a singleton, IOC will create the object for the bean at the time of starting only. It will create the object. If you don't want only one object, every time I want a new object, when I call getBean method, then I want to get the new object. Then we need to specify scope as a prototype. When you specify prototype scope, so every time a new object will be created by IOC container on demand basis. What is the meaning of on demand basis? Whenever you call getBean method, then only it is going to create the object for the bean. Are you guys clear? Perfect. So with this, we are stopping our discussion related to Spring framework, and we are going to start our discussion related to Spring Boot, which is very, 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 very important. Okay, good. What is our course? Actual course. Spring Boot with microservices. So we need to learn Spring Boot with microservices. Before going to start the Spring Boot, we had some discussion related to Spring framework, because to understand the fundamental concepts of the Spring framework. Good. Now here, let's start our discussion related to Spring Boot now, because in the Spring Boot, lot of things are automated. It is very easy to develop our application by using Spring Boot. Okay. So first of all, what is this Spring Boot? So we can say Spring Boot is an extension for Spring Framework. Spring Framework is already available in the market from 2003-2004 onwards. The first production version of the Spring came into market in the year of 2004. Okay. Now, after 10 years, in the 2014, Spring Boot came into picture. What is this Spring Boot? Spring Boot is an extension for Spring Framework. So Spring Boot is not a replacement for the Spring Framework. Spring Boot is extension for the Spring Framework. So Spring Boot is an extension for the Spring Framework, and we can say Spring Boot is an approach to develop. It is one approach to develop Spring-based applications with less configurations. Spring Boot is an approach to develop Spring-based applications with less configurations. That means now we can develop our application in two ways. Assume that I want to develop one Java application. In order to develop this Java application, we have two options. The first option is you can go for just a Spring Framework. You can use Spring Framework. There are so many modules available in the Spring Framework. By using these modules, you can develop a Java application. If you develop this Java application using Spring Framework, then you are responsible for configurations, guys. Programmer should take care of the configuration, nothing but beans.xml file we need to create, IOC container you need to start, XML file you need to give as the input for the IOC container. That configurations programmer should perform manually. So that's the reason they came up with another approach to develop Spring-based applications, that is called Spring Boot. So by using Spring Framework, you can develop the Java application. By using Spring Boot also, you can develop the Java application. So how many ways we can develop our application now? In two ways. By using Spring Framework, you can develop the application. By using Spring Boot also, you can develop the application. But what is the difference? If you develop the project using Spring Framework, configurations should be taken care by programmer. Now, if you see in our application, I have created bean.xml and I am configuring my bean definitions here. Then I am going for test class. I'm starting the IOC container. I'm getting the object from the IOC container. This beans configuration file, is it only my project requirement? Everybody who is using Spring, they need to go with the bean configuration file. They need to start the IOC container programmatically. So then only their application will execute. Then Spring people understood that Spring Framework became very popular in the market from 2009. So from 2004 it is available, but from 2009 that framework became very popular in the market. Then the Spring team identified that everybody using Spring Framework to develop the application, but everybody taking care of configurations on their own. Why can't we automate that configuration? Why can't we provide some common logic so that people can develop the projects very easily? That's where Spring Boot came into picture. Spring Boot is an approach to develop Spring-based application. That means whatever the application you can develop by using Spring Framework, same type of application you can develop by using Spring Boot also. The advantage is auto configuration. When you go for Spring Boot, what is the main advantage? The main advantage with the Spring Boot is auto configuration. Programmer no need to take care of the configurations in the Spring Boot. Configurations will be taken care by Spring Boot. So here Spring framework is already available from 2004. The same company developed Spring Boot and released into market in the 2014. The reason in the Spring you need to take care of the configurations, whereas when you go for the Spring Boot it will provide auto configuration. What is the definition for the Spring Boot? Spring Boot is an extension for the Spring framework. Spring Boot is an approach to develop Spring-based applications with less configuration. What type of applications, what type of apps we can develop using Spring? Same type of apps we can develop using Spring Boot also. Whatever you can do by using Spring framework, same thing you can do by using Spring Boot also. Then why Spring Boot? Already Spring is there. We can develop standalone application. We can develop web application. We can develop distributed application by using Spring. Same thing we can do by using Spring Boot also. Then why we should go for Spring Boot? Then why should we go for Spring Boot? The main advantage with the Spring Boot, auto configuration. You no need to create any XML file. You no need to start any IOC container. Everything will be taken care by Spring Boot. That is the reason Spring Boot is an extension for Spring framework. And another point here, guys, Spring Boot will use Spring internally. Spring Boot internally using Spring framework. Okay, so it is developed on top of the Spring framework. Whatever you can do by using Spring, same thing can be done by using Spring Boot also. Are you guys clear? If anybody asks you what is a Spring Boot, can you tell me what is the definition for the Spring Boot? Spring Boot is an approach to develop Spring-based applications with less configurations. Spring Boot is an approach to develop Spring-based applications with less configuration. Spring Boot is an extension for Spring framework. What type of applications we can develop using Spring? Same type of applications we can develop using Spring Boot also. Spring Boot internally using Spring framework. Using Spring Boot, we can achieve rapid application development. So Spring Boot supports rapid application development. Rapid application development means quickly, within fraction of minutes, we will be able to develop the application. We will be able to execute the application because you no need to bother about the configuration. You no need to bother about the container. Everything will be taken care by Spring Boot. Now, what are the advantages with the Spring Boot? So what are the main reasons that people are going for Spring Boot? Advantages with a Spring Boot. The first advantage with the Spring Boot is form starters. When you go for the Spring Boot, the first advantage is form starters. Form starters nothing but Maven dependencies. Now we are configuring Maven dependencies. For example, if I want to develop an application by using Spring, then we will create a Maven project. In the Maven project, we are creating a Maven project. In the Maven project, we need to configure lot of dependencies. But when you go for the Spring Boot, they are giving a concept called form starter. With the form starters, we can simplify Maven dependencies in the application. So here we have examples. For example, if you want to develop a standalone application by using Spring Boot, then we have Spring Boot starter, form starter. If you add one single dependency, that is sufficient to create a Spring Boot standalone application. Suppose if you want to create a web application, then Spring Boot starter web dependency available. If you add just one dependency, that is sufficient to develop a web application by using Spring Boot. If you want to communicate with the data JPA, then Spring Boot starter data JPA dependency available. If you want to send a email by using Spring Boot starter mail dependency is available. If you want to secure your application, Spring Boot starter security is available. Like this, there are several POM starters given by Spring Boot. What is the advantage with these POM starters, guys? What is the advantage with the POM starters? POM starters are going to simplify our Maven configuration. POM starters are going to simplify Maven configuration. You no need to add so many dependencies to develop a Spring Boot application. You just add one POM starter, then it will download all the required dependencies for you. You can simplify Maven pom.xml configuration by using POM starter. POM starter nothing but Spring Boot dependency. What are the dependencies are required for the application? They provided them as a POM starter. So the first advantage with the Spring Boot, POM starters. What is the meaning of POM starters? Come on. What is the meaning of POM starters? POM starters nothing but Maven configurations. Okay. The second advantage with the Spring Boot is dependency version conflicts resolution. Dependency version conflict solution. Dependency version conflict solution. Now, if you see, I'm using Spring context. Okay. If I remove the version number, is it going to work now? If I remove the version number, is it working? So that means you need to decide which version dependency you want to add in the project. For the Spring, I'm going for 6.1.0. Okay. Now, if I go for a Hibernate, which version is required? If I go for JUnit, which version is required? Which version of Hibernate supports Spring 6.1 version? Which version of the Spring supports JUnit version? Okay. Identifying version conflicts is very, very difficult. So that's why when you go for the Spring Boot, you no need to configure version for the dependency. When you go for the Spring Boot, no need to configure version for the dependency. If you tell, I want a Hibernate, Spring Boot will identify what is the latest version of the Hibernate. It will download that latest version of the Hibernate for our project. So as a programmer, you no need to specify dependency version in the pom.xml when you go for Spring Boot, because Spring Boot will identify what is the latest version. It is going to download the latest version, will add to our project. So in the Spring framework, you need to configure the dependencies and you need to specify version number also for the dependency. But in the Spring Boot, that is not required, because in the Spring Boot, we are going to use POM starters. Maven dependencies will be simplified. And for that POM starter, you no need to specify version number. Boot will identify which version is required for our project, which is the latest version in the market. That latest version it will download and it will add that into our project. Are you guys clear? Fine. The next one is third advantage with the Spring Boot, which is called auto configuration. The main advantage with the Spring Boot. Why Spring Boot is having this much demand in the market? The reason for that is auto configuration. What is the meaning of this auto configuration? What configuration? Remember, whenever you are developing a application, some configuration is required for the application. Whatever the configuration is required, like configuring the beans.xml, starting the IOC container, creating the connection pool, performing the dependency injection, you no need to perform these activities manually, because Boot will identify what configuration required for the application. Boot will identify what configuration required for the application and it will provide that configuration for the application. That is called auto configuration. Can you tell me what is auto configuration? What is auto configuration? What configuration is required for the application? that will be identified by the Spring Boot, and it will provide that configuration for our application. Simple example. Here, if we add data JPA starter, it will create a connection pool. Are you guys getting my point? If you add data JPA starter in my boot project, if I am adding starter data JPA, what is the purpose of starter data JPA? What is the purpose of data JPA? To communicate with the database. So to communicate with the database, connection is required, and that too, connection pool is required. So if you add this starter in the pom.xml, boot will understand, okay, this programmer want to communicate with the database. For this programmer, connections are required. Let me create the connection pool. So Spring Boot will come up with the configuration that is called auto configuration. What configuration? Based on your pom.xml, boot will understand what configuration required for the application, and it will provide that configuration for our project. Programmer no need to write any configurations. One example, if you add data JPA starter, Spring Boot will create the connection pool for our application. That is called auto configuration. And the second one, when we run the Spring Boot application, it will start IOC container. Earlier in the Spring framework, I am starting the IOC container by using application context. From now onwards, do I need to start the IOC container? No. When I am creating a project by using Spring or Spring Boot, IOC is mandatory to perform the dependency injection. So starting the IOC container, only my project requirement. Every Spring project requires IOC container to perform dependency injection. When it is common for everybody, why everybody should write the logic to start the IOC? That will be taken care by Spring Boot. So from now onwards, you no need to write the logic to start the IOC container. Who will start the IOC container? Spring Boot is going to start the IOC container. If we add data JPA starter, boot will create the connection pool. If we run the boot application, it will start IOC container by default. If we add web starter, it will deploy our app in server. So when we go for servlets, what we have done? How do we execute a servlet application? We created a servlet project. We downloaded a Tomcat server. We installed a Tomcat server. We deployed our application in the Tomcat server. But when you go for the Spring Boot, you no need to download the Tomcat server. You no need to deploy your application in the Tomcat server. If you add web starter, what Spring Boot will understand? If you add web starter, when people will add the web starter? When people will add web starter in the pom.xml? When they want to develop a web application. How to execute a web application? By using a server. Without server, can we run the web application? No. But here, when you go for the Spring framework, it is a programmer responsibility to deploy the application in the server. But when you go for the Spring Boot, you no need to download the Tomcat. You can delete the Tomcat from your system, uninstall Tomcat from your system. From now onwards, we are going to use the Spring Boot application. In the Spring Boot application, if I add web starter, it will deploy our application in server. You no need to deploy the application in the server. Boot will deploy your application in the server. That is called auto configuration. So from now onwards, do I need to deal with the server? Who will take care of the server? Spring Boot is going to take care of the server. Are you clear with my point? Are you guys clear with my point? Right. So here, what is the first advantage with the Spring Boot? POM starters. What is the meaning of a POM starter in the Spring Boot? What is the meaning of POM starter in the Spring Boot? It is simplifying Maven dependency configuration. So you no need to add n number of dependencies to develop your application. Simplified Maven dependencies by using POM starters. What is the second advantage with the Spring Boot? Dependency version conflict solution. That means you no need to add the version number for the dependency. Who will identify dependency version? Spring Boot is going to identify which version dependency required for our application. Then what is auto configuration? What is auto configuration? What configurations are required for the application? Boot will identify based on the pom.xml. What configurations are required for the application? Boot will identify based on the pom.xml and it will provide that configuration. Can you tell me some examples for that? Can you tell me some examples for that? If we add data JPA starter, what will happen? It will create a connection pool. When we run the boot application, what will happen? It will start the IOC container. If I add a web starter, then what will happen? It will deploy our application in the server. And another advantage, if we add security starter, it will provide login page for our application. So if you add security starter in the pom.xml, by default it will provide login page for our application. So it will secure our application by default. It will secure our application by default. Can we see these concepts with a practical example now? Can we see one example practically to understand what the Spring Boot is doing now? Okay, first tell me, what is the Spring Boot? What are the advantages with the Spring Boot? What is a Spring Boot? What are the advantages with the Spring Boot? Spring Boot, come on, what is Spring Boot? Spring Boot is an approach to develop Spring-based applications with less configurations. Can I say Spring Boot is a replacement for the Spring? No, why? It is an extension. We are using Spring Boot internally using Spring Framework. What are the advantages with the Spring Boot? First advantage is form starter. Second advantage, dependency version solution. You no need to specify the version number. What is the third advantage? What is the third advantage? Auto configuration. What is the meaning of auto configuration? It will provide the required configurations for the application based on the pom.xml. Can you tell me some examples for the auto configuration? If I add the data JPA, what it will perform? It will create the connection pool. So if I run the boot application, what will happen? IOC container will start. If I add web starter, what will happen? Server will be started. If I add security starter, what will happen? It will provide login page for our application. And we can achieve rapid application development with the Spring Boot. What is the meaning of rapid application development? Quick development. Quickly we can run your application in the production. You no need to bother about the configurations and all. Let us see how to create one project by using Spring Boot and how to run that project by using Spring Boot. In the Eclipse, do we have any option for the Spring project creation? No. In the Eclipse, we don't have any option to create the Spring project. Let me close my Eclipse. Now, here guys, to create the Spring Boot application, we have two options. To create the Spring Boot application, we have two options. So what are those two options? First one, you can go for start.spring.io website. What is this, guys? Start.spring.io website. Here you can create the Spring project, or else you can go for Spring Toolsuite IDE, or you can go for IntelliJ IDE also. Either Spring Toolsuite or IntelliJ IDE you can use to create that. Okay, so let me download Spring Toolsuite IDE. Let me go for Spring Toolsuite IDE, which is also called as STS, which is given by Spring Framework. It is similar to Eclipse only, but it is easy to create Spring or Spring Boot applications by using STS IDE. We can use IntelliJ IDE also. Let me go for STS download. Spring Tool Suite, go here. Now, Spring Tool Suite 4th version is available for Visual Studio Code, for Eclipse. Now, Spring Tool Suite, here it is available now. Let me download Spring Tool Suite 4. I want to download for Windows operating system. I want to download STS for Windows operating system. Click on 4.2.0.1. Click on this. So when I click on this option, Spring Tool Suite option, what it is downloading? One jar file it is going to download. What it is downloading, guys? One jar file it is downloading. Do you know how to run the jar file? How to run the jar file? Java space hyphen jar space jar file name. Now let me go to my downloads folder. Here you can see I have downloaded STS IDE. How this STS IDE is downloaded? As a jar file. Copy this jar file. Copy this jar file. Software is available here. I'm keeping my jar file here. This is Spring Tool Suite jar file. Okay. Let's open our command prompt and let us execute our jar file. I opened my command prompt. Let me execute my jar file. Here, is there any STS IDE available? Currently, is there any STS IDE available? No. Only STS jar file is available. Open the command prompt and execute that jar file. What is the command to execute a jar file? Java space hyphen jar space the jar file name. Whatever the Spring Tool Suite jar is available, I'm executing that jar file by using Java space hyphen jar space jar file name. Enter. I'm executing that jar file. See what will happen. Yes, jar file got executed. Once the jar file is executed, can you see we got the STS IDE? Yes, open the STS IDE. Here, there is a file called Spring Tool Suite 4.exe. Spring Tool Suite 4.exe file is available. Are you able to understand how to set up STS IDE? How to set up STS IDE? How to set up STS IDE, guys? Just go to Google and type STS download for Windows. It will give you official spring.io website. Go to that website. Spring Tool Suite 4th version, which is the latest version. Spring Tool Suite for Eclipse. I'm going to download this IDE. Here we have a option for Windows. When you click on this Windows option, it will download a jar file. Once the jar file is downloaded, what is the next step? Once the jar is downloaded, what is the next step? We have executed that jar file. Then we got the STS IDE. So go to that STS IDE folder and click on sts.exe file. Okay. Now, what is happened now? Spring Tool Suite 4 IDE is getting opened. Spring Tool Suite 4 IDE is getting opened. So by using this IDE, we can create Spring Boot applications easily. Wait, it is taking time now. Yes, it is asking choose the workspace where you want to develop your applications now. Already we are having a workspace. 36 SBMS workspace is available. Okay, this is Spring application workspace. So let me create another workspace, SBMS workspace. SBMS workspace. Let me take this path and give that path as a input. I want to develop my applications by using this SBMS workspace. Click on launch. Yes, we are able to open our Spring Tool Suite IDE. Yes. Yeah. So once we open the Spring Tool Suite IDE, can you see the option now? What is the first option? Create a Java project. What is the second option? Create a Maven project. What is the third option? Create new Spring Starter project. Spring Starter project, nothing but Spring Boot application. Spring Starter project, nothing but Spring Boot application. Are you clear? Good. Now let me create a starter project. When I create the starter project, it is asking what is the name you want. I'm going to give the name Spring Boot app. I want to create my first application by using Spring Boot. For this Spring Boot application, what is the build tool? Do you want to go for Maven or you want to go for Gradle? I want to go for Maven. What is a Maven? What is a Maven? Come on. Maven is a build tool. Maven is a build tool. So package, what type of project you want? jar or var? I want to create the jar file. Java version. Currently, the latest version of the Spring Boot is 3.x. Spring Boot 3.x version we are using. To work with the Spring Boot 3.x version, Java 17 is mandatory. Java 17 is mandatory. And the language, Spring Boot supports for 3 languages. Not only for Java, you can use Kotlin also to develop boot application. You can use Groovy also to develop a boot application. We can use Java also to develop boot application. Going with Java, group ID. What is the meaning of group ID? Company name, in.ashok IT, artifact ID, project name, version. What package you want in your application? You can give any package name. I'm giving the package name as in.ashok IT. I'm giving the package name as in.ashok IT. Click on next. What is the latest version of the Spring Boot? 3.x version. 3.1.5 is the latest stable version of the Spring Boot. What are the dependencies you want? What dependencies you want for your project? I want a dependency called Web Starter. So there is a dependency called Web Starter. Let me go for Spring Web. Let me type for a dependency called Spring Web dependency. What will happen if I select a Spring Web dependency? What will happen if I add a web dependency? It will provide server also. Now, can you read this? When you go for web dependency, can you read this? What we can do with the web dependency? Come on, read that. Build web, including RESTful applications using build web, including RESTful applications using Spring MVC and uses, come on, and uses Apache Tomcat as the default embedded container. So build web, including RESTful applications using Spring MVC. That means if you want to create a web application, if you want to create a distributed application by using MVC architecture, then you can go for Spring Web Starter. And another advantage with the Web Starter, it will provide Apache Tomcat server by default. You no need to install the server. You no need to configure the server. You just add the Web Starter. Server will be available for your application. That server provided by the Spring Boot, that's why it is called as a embedded server. Whatever the server we need, that server is called embedded server. That means it will provide by the Spring Boot. Okay. Now I selected one dependency called Spring Web dependency. Click on next. Now click on finish. So with this, we are creating our first project by using Spring Boot. We are creating our first project by using Spring Boot. Good. It is taking time to download the dependencies because first time we are creating Spring Boot application. All the required dependencies it is downloading from the Maven repository. Good. Fine guys, with this our boot application is created. Can you see Maven folder structure? Can you see Maven folder structure? Main Java, main resources, test Java, Maven dependencies, target, pom.xml. See the Maven dependencies. How many jar files it downloaded? See that how many jar files it is downloaded? Is it downloading only one jar file? Is it downloading only one jar file? No. So many jars are downloaded. Go to pom.xml. Go to pom.xml file. What dependencies we added in the pom.xml? We added only web starter. Is there any version for the dependency? Who will take care of the version? Spring Boot. How many dependencies I'm adding? Only web starter. By default, it is giving the test starter. With one dependency, how many jar files are downloaded? Around 50-60 jar files it has downloaded. Can I say it is simplifying our Maven configuration with the POM starter? It is simplifying Maven dependencies with the POM starter. I no need to write a lot of dependencies in the pom.xml. I just added one dependency. It downloaded all the required jar files to develop a web application by using Spring Boot. So that is the first advantage that I have explained. POM starters. So POM starters simplified Maven dependencies. I just added web starter, 50 jar files it has downloaded. Okay. Then next one, dependency version conflict. Am I adding any version number for the dependency? I want to use a JUnit. Do I need to add a dependency for that? No, not required. I want to use Hibernate. Any version required? No. Version will be taken care by Spring Boot. Then next one, auto configuration. Can you tell me what is auto configuration? Come on, guys. Can you tell me what is auto configuration? Auto configuration means what configuration is required for your project, it will provide. How Spring Boot will understand what configuration required for the project? pom.xml. Based on the pom.xml. In my pom.xml, which starter I have added? Which starter I have added? Web starter I have added. Okay, guys. Only I have added web starter. Let me run my application. When you go for Spring Boot, by default, one class will be created with the main method. This is called as a start class. This is called as a start class. Right click, run as Java application. Right click, run as a Java application. Now, see this. I'm running this start class available in the Spring Boot. See what will happen. Now you will understand the advantage with the Spring Boot. Okay. Now, if you see here, what is this concept, guys? Root web application context. That means it started IOC container. So am I writing any logic to start the IOC container? Am I writing any logic to start the IOC container? Because it is part of auto configuration. And can you read this one? Tomcat server started with the port number 8080. Why it is giving the Tomcat server for me? Why it is giving the Tomcat server for me? Because we have added web starter. So web starter is used to develop a web application. Web starter is used to develop a web application. So for web application, server is mandatory. That's why Spring Boot is providing the server. That server which is provided by the Spring Boot is called as embedded server. What is the another advantage with the Spring Boot? It will provide embedded servers. That means you no need to deploy your web application in the server manually. Server creation, server startup, application deployment, everything will be taken care by Spring Boot. Are you guys getting my point? So now embedded server, it will provide server to run our application. To run our application, what type of servers providing by the Spring Boot? Spring Boot is providing Tomcat as one embedded server. If you don't want Tomcat, you have here another server called Jetty, and we have here another server called Netty. So there are 3 embedded servers available in the Spring Boot. By default, it will give Tomcat as a embedded server. If you don't want Tomcat, you can go for Jetty server. You can go for Netty server also. But what is the default one? In the interview, they will ask you how to change embedded server from Tomcat to Jetty. That is an interview question. So by default, when you add a web starter, it will give the Tomcat server. But I don't want the Tomcat. I want to go for Jetty. How to change from Tomcat to Jetty in the Spring Boot. We will discuss in the WebMVC concept. Are you guys clear? Now, let me create one class. Let me create one web application. New class. I'm creating one welcome REST controller. Just I want to show you how much time it is taking to develop a web application. Okay. I'm going to create one REST controller. I'm creating one REST controller. Now, public string get message. Public string get message return welcome to Ashok IT. That's it. My web application is ready. So we developed a web application by using servlets. What we have done to develop a web application by using servlet? We need to create a project. We need to add the jar file, create a servlet by extending HTTP servlet, override the do-get method, do-post method, configure the servlet in the web.xml, then install the server, run your application. In this lot of story we need to do. But in the Spring Boot, rapid application development. What is the meaning of rapid application development? Quickly you can set up your application. Do I need to bother about web.xml? Do I need to bother about the server? Do I need to bother about the deployment? Nothing. Everything will be taken care by Spring Boot. Now see here, run as boot application. I'm running my Spring Boot application. When I run my Spring Boot application, IOC container started, Tomcat server started with the 8080 port number. Go to browser, let me access my application, localhost colon 8080. Am I able to access my application? How much time it is taking to run a web application by using Spring Boot? Hardly 1 minute. Hardly within 1 minute, you create the project and you run the project. So that is called rapid application development. Okay, now everybody can access this URL. I want to secure my application. Everybody can access this URL. I want to secure my application. Do I need to write any logic to secure our application? No, just to go to form.xml, add security starter. Let us add one dependency called security starter. Take the dependency Spring Boot starter security. What is the dependency I have added, guys? Spring Boot starter security dependency I have added. That's it. Am I writing any code for the security? Am I writing any code for the security? No. What I have done, I have added a web starter. Tomcat server is coming. I'm adding a security starter. What happened? Login page will come. Okay, check that. Refresh. Run our application. Run as boot application. For your application, password also generated. Now, go and access our application. When I access same URL, what happened now? When I access the same application, what happened now? Who provided this login page? Spring Security. Enter some dummy data. It is validating our credentials are valid or not. It is validating our credentials are valid or not. Now, what are the credentials? Password is printed on the console. Password is printed on the console. The username will be user. Password printed on the console. Click on sign in. If credentials are valid, it is giving the output from our application. That is the power of auto configuration. Now, I don't want to go with the default credentials. I want to configure my own credentials. If you want to configure your own credentials in the boot application, there is a properties file. In the properties file, you can write that spring.security.username. My username is Ashok IT. Spring.security.password. Spring.security.user password abc@123. Now, if you enter this username and password, then only your login will be success. Otherwise, your login will be failure. Do I need to write the logic to verify? Do I need to write the logic to capture the form data, verify the credentials are valid or not? If credentials are invalid, display the same page with the error message. If the credentials are valid, display the dashboard. Do I need to write that logic? No. I just added security starter. Okay, let me run my application now. Okay, I'm going to run my application now. Stop the server, run this project, run as boot application. Run as boot application. Earlier it printed a default password. Now is it printing the default password? No. What is the reason? I configured my username and password. So go to browser, localhost colon 8080. What happened? When I access my URL, what is happening? Am I able to access the application directly? No, because security added by the Spring Boot. Enter some dummy data. It is saying that, boss, credentials are invalid. Credentials are invalid. I have configured my credentials. Ashok ID, abc@123, sign in. My credentials are valid, then I am able to access my application. So who is providing the security for our application, guys? Who is providing the security for our application? What is that concept in the Spring Boot? Now, what is the meaning of auto configuration? What is the meaning of auto configuration? What configuration is required for your application that will be provided by Spring Boot. So if you add JPA starter, connection pool will be created. If you run the boot application, IOC container starting. If you add the web starter, it will deploy your application in the server. If you add the security starter, it will provide login page for the application. Are you guys clear? Now, what is the meaning of embedded server in the Spring Boot? What is the meaning of embedded server in the Spring Boot? You no need to download and install the server to run the web application. You just add the web starter. Boot will provide a server to run your application. What type of servers provided by the Spring Boot? What type of servers provided by the Spring Boot? Spring Boot is providing Tomcat, Jetty and Netty. It is providing Tomcat, Jetty and Netty servers. Are you clear? Next one. There is another advantage with the Spring Boot that is called actuators. Spring Boot provided a concept called actuator to monitor our application. What is the purpose of actuators? Actuators are used to monitor our application. What is the meaning of monitoring? When our application is running, we want to understand what is health of the application. What is the health of the application? Is our application is up and running or not? Is there any problem in the application? And how many classes loaded by our application? How many threads are running in our application? How many objects are created in our application? What is the heap memory in our application? How many threads are sleeping? How many threads are running? What kind of classes are loaded by our application? What properties loaded by our application? What URL patterns available in the application? Everything we can monitor by using actuators. What is the purpose of actuators in the Spring Boot? Actuators are used to monitor our application. These are the main advantages with the Spring Boot. Are you guys able to understand? You have seen practically. You may not understand what is the code I am writing, but are you able to understand the benefit we are getting with the Spring Boot? What is the benefit we are getting with the Spring Boot? Come on, guys. What is the benefit we are getting with the Spring Boot? We are getting form starters benefit. What is the meaning of form starter? What is the meaning of form starter? It is simplifying Maven configuration for our application. If I add just one dependency, web starter, 50 jar files it downloaded. You no need to add all the dependencies. One dependency will download everything which is required to develop our application. Form starters. There are so many form starters available. Can you tell some form starter names? Web starter, JPA starter, security starter, mail starter, actuator, starter, like that. There are several POM starters available. What is the second advantage with the Spring Boot? What is the second advantage with the Spring Boot? Version. Do I need to specify version number for the dependency? That will be taken care by Spring Boot. Third advantage, auto configuration. What is the meaning of auto configuration? What is the meaning of auto configuration? The configurations required for the application will be provided by Spring Boot. Can you tell some examples for auto configurations? Can you tell me some examples for auto configuration? If I add JPA, connection pool will be available for me. I no need to load the driver. I no need to create the connection. Connection pool also I no need to create. Everything will be taken care by Spring Boot. If I add web starter, it will deploy your application in the server. What is the default server we are getting? Tomcat. What are the servers supported by Spring Boot? Tomcat, Jetty, and Netty. Okay. If I add security starter, I'm getting the default login page for authentication. Do I need to write the logic for authentication? Who will take care of that? Who provided this beautiful login page for us? Spring Boot only providing that login page. And embedded server is the other advantage. In the Spring Boot, embedded server is the other advantage. What is the meaning of that embedded server? What is the meaning of embedded server? So by default, it will provide the server to run your application. So if you add web starter, server will be available. You no need to bother about the server setup. You don't need to bother about server setup also. Next one. What is the actuator in the Spring Boot? Come on, guys. What is actuator in the Spring Boot? The actuator is used to monitor and manage our application. What is the meaning of monitoring our application? What is the meaning of monitoring our application, guys? Come on, fast. It is used to check the health of the application. What is the health? How many classes loaded? How many threads are running? How many objects are created? What are the URL patterns available? Everything we can monitor by using Spring Boot. What is the difference between Spring and Spring Boot? If I go for Spring, POM starters not available. Version number I need to configure. Auto configuration will not be there. Everything I need to do programmatically. I need to create the connection pool. I need to deploy in the server. I need to manage my application. I need to write the security for my application. Everything I need to do. Embedded server concept is not there in the Spring. Actuators are not there in the Spring. So that is the reason nowadays in the market, Spring Boot is having lot of demand. The main advantage with the Spring Boot, auto configuration. Based on the pom.xml, it will identify what configuration required for the application and it will provide that configuration for the application. Are you guys clear? What is the Spring Boot? What is the definition for the Spring Boot? Come on. What is Spring Boot? Spring Boot is one approach to develop Spring applications with less configuration. Spring Boot is an extension for the Spring framework. Spring Boot is internally using Spring framework. By using Spring Boot, we can achieve rapid application development. What are the advantages? POM starter, dependency version conflict solution, auto configuration, embedded servers, actuators. Now tell me, people will develop a project with servlet JDBC JSP. If you go for that, what is the problem? Lot of time it is going to take. Do you think that people will develop a project with only Spring? When these many advantages are there, when these many features are available, why people will go for Spring framework? Spring framework is old approach. 2009, 2010, up to 2015, people used to develop the project by using Spring. In the 2014, Spring Boot came into market, which is a big change in the Java community. From 2015 onwards, people are working on the Spring Boot to develop the applications. Are you guys clear? So now some people will think that I'm a fresher, Spring Boot is only for experienced people. So Spring Boot is only for experienced people, even for freshers also. Tomorrow you will get the job as a fresher. You will get the job as a fresher. Can you say to your manager, I'm a fresher, I will work with only Spring? No. That project will be using Spring Boot. Whether you are a fresher or whether you are an experienced person, you have to develop the project with the Spring Boot. That is industry standard now. In the industry, 99.9% of projects are running on the Spring Boot. That 0.01% of the projects are running on the Spring. Those are legacy applications, very old applications running on the Spring. 99.9% of the projects are running on the Spring Boot only. Any legacy project is available, they are migrating to the Spring Boot because of its advantages, because of rapid application development. Are you clear? Good. Any questions? Anyone? Anybody having any questions? You got the basic idea? What is the Spring Boot? What are the advantages with the Spring Boot? So Spring Boot is one approach to develop Spring applications with less configurations. Okay. So we can say Spring Boot is equal to Spring plus auto configuration, Spring plus auto configuration, Spring plus auto configuration minus XML. Is there any XML available? No. So whenever we are going for the Spring Boot, that means we are working with the Spring only. When we go for the Spring Boot, internally it is using the Spring. Along with the Spring, what we are getting? Auto configuration. From the Spring, what we removed? XML. This is the conclusion for the Spring Boot. Spring Boot is equal to Spring plus auto configuration minus XML configuration. We don't use any XML file when we are working with the Spring Boot. Is there any beans configuration file available? Is there any beans configuration file available? There is no beans configuration file available. Is there any logic to start the IOC container? Is there any logic to start the IOC container? There is no logic to start the IOC container. Who will start that IOC container? Who will start the IOC container? Spring Boot is going to start that IOC container. Clear? Good. Now guys, today I want you people to set up ToolSuite IDE to develop our Spring Boot applications. Okay. STS setup. STS provided by Spring Framework only. Spring team provided STS IDE to develop Spring and Spring Boot applications. So how to set up this STS IDE? Go here, download it. I'm giving the direct link here. Okay. If you hit this URL in the browser, jar file will be downloaded. What is the first step? What is the first step? Download STS jar file using below link. Then what is the second step? What is the second step? Run the jar file using CMD. What is the syntax to run that? Java space hyphen jar space jar name. Whatever the jar you are downloading. Then step 3. In that folder, open sts.exe file. Open sts.exe file. Then it will open Spring ToolSuite IDE. Once the ToolSuite IDE is available, create Spring Boot application. Create Spring Boot application. There are 2 ways available to create the Spring Boot application, guys. One is by using Spring Start website. Okay. So we can create the Spring Boot application by using start.spring.io. So this is called Spring Initializer. This is called Spring Initializer website to create the boot application. Second one, STS IDE or IntelliJ IDE. Any IDE you can use to create your boot application. If I create the boot application by using start.spring.io, I need to download that application as a zip file, and I need to extract the zip file. I need to import into my IDE. That problem is there. Okay. If I create one project, Spring Boot project from Spring Initializer website, which is start.spring.io, project will be downloaded as a zip file. I need to extract that zip file. I need to import that project into STS IDE manual process. Instead of that, directly we can create the project by using STS IDE. Are you clear? So today, can you create one simple boot application and can you run that and can you check whether it is working or not? Yes or no? Yes, good. Any questions, anyone? Anybody having any questions? You got the basic idea? What is Spring Boot? What are the advantages with the Spring Boot? How to create a first project by using Spring Boot? Yes? Any questions for offline students? No questions? Good. Thank you guys. With this, I'm stopping for today. We'll continue tomorrow.